strange that your husband...
That my husband what?
That he sent you to town to look after this little errand. Why doesn't he come and rescue his friend?
Oh, no. He couldn't.
It's my great pleasure to be speaking today to Laila Robins, who is playing the role of Hedda Gabler in Ibsen's great dark masterpiece, Hedda Gabler, written in 1990, playing currently now. Talk about how you began your journey as an actor, so as a native to St. Paul, how you became attracted to acting, particularly to the Guthrie.
Yes, I grew up in St. Paul, and my parents were immigrants from Latvia, and my mother loved the theater, so she used to take us to the Guthrie Theater all the time as children. And I started putting plays on in my basement, and I believe the first production was Rumpelstiltskin.
Oh, great.
Where I turned a tricycle upside down and made it the spinning wheel.
Right.
And I used to put plays on and have the neighborhood kids come and give them free Kool-Aid as some kind of bribe to get them into the house.
Right.
And I remember early on I saw, it's kind of ironic now that I think of it, I saw a movie of 101 Dalmatians, and I was very attracted to the character of Cruella de Vil, I have to say. I'm making that connection today for the first time. And I just thought she was so interesting and exciting, and I think perhaps this is my chance to play her in Hedda. For many years I was asked to come to the Guthrie under other regimes. Garland Wright invited me several times. But at that time it was a repertory theater, and they wanted you to come for about 4 to 6 months, and it was a little too long for me to leave New York. But now the gigs, as you call them, are shorter, and I'm able to come here more often.
Right. Now, we talk about Hedda Gabler, sometimes considered a borderline personality, sometimes considered simplistically almost as just, she's an evil character. Can you talk about the journey, in terms of the rehearsal process, the journey to find layers and dimensions and subtleties in that character?
Yes. The way I approach characters, I look at what they do, simply at what they do, and then I try to figure out some sort of psychology of the person who would do that. What makes someone do that? And I don't believe that people are just demonic or evil. I believe that a bunch of circumstances came together to create this person, Hedda. And so I dig into what those things might be. I was working with the idea that first of all, the society that she lives in is very repressive for women. Even the corsets alone, I'm telling you, wearing them in the show, it's very difficult to breathe, and you find yourself getting very angry because you're unable to breathe and express yourself properly. Women were not allowed to go out unescorted. Even when you were married, your girlfriend could come over for maybe 2 hours a week to have tea with you. It was a very isolated, lonely sort of existence, so there wasn't a lot of place for expression. Also, women had to live through men. Whether the character of Thea lives through Lovborg and then eventually Tesman, Auntie Julia lives through her nephew. All the women are trying to survive. Now, Hedda's problem is that she is a very independent creature. She had a general for a father. I think she was very enamored of him. I think he was a very courageous man, and she had a lot of respect for him. I also believe that he was a disciplinarian and instilled a sort of sense of perfectionism in her. And I think that kind of perfectionism can lead people to be disappointed, and they have high expectations of the world and the people around them. And then when they don't get that, they become, a healthy person learns to process that, but this is pre-therapy, so she turns it into destructive actions. There's no mention of her mother, and I was working a lot with the idea that she seems to have such a fear of being pregnant, or almost a phobia of being pregnant. And I thought, well, what would make somebody so afraid of that? Well, you could look at it and say, well, it's the vanity. She doesn't want to get old. There is some fear of aging that seems to be evident in her lines. But there's also a phobia about death. And I came up with the idea that perhaps her mother died in childbirth while giving birth to her. And so here is an opportunity where she's going to be having a baby, and perhaps she has some sort of fear about dying in childbirth. I'm trying to hook into what makes somebody that intense or have such an intense emotion about things. She was also raised in a specific class that she was used to, and she seems to have a real disdain for the bourgeoisie or for things that aren't quite up to snuff. She also, as I said, it's sort of pre-therapy, pre-Freud, and so she's pointing the finger outward. She's pointing at things around her and saying, you are making me unhappy. Instead of, if she were given some therapy, she could perhaps start to see her own participation in creating the hell around her. because it certainly is a hell that she's created, and she can't seem to get out of it. She also has a real control issues. She loves to make people do things. I think someone who feels powerful doesn't have to enact their power all the time. Obviously, Hedda doesn't feel very powerful. She has a line in the play where she says, "For once in my life, I want to have power over someone else." Now, a person who says that obviously did not feel very powerful. So my feeling is that perhaps her father was a disciplinarian, perhaps he was somewhat brutal. You know, perhaps he ran the household as like an army, and that she always felt always under his thumb. The final thing at the end of the play with Judge Brock is the realization that she will be under his power because he blackmails her. And that is the final thing that she can't live with. So there's some sort of power struggle there. It's interesting because this play, a lot of people project onto this play their own issues because it's such a touchstone or hot spot, because it's so much about power, and it's so much about power between men and women as well. She wants to have power over Lovborg. He can't quite live up to her expectation once again because he's an alcoholic. He has a weakness. Finally, when she can't control him, the last thing you can do is have power over yourself, over your own life. And someone suggested to me that it was like those Dostoevskian religious fanatics, that in the end they transcend this world by finally becoming God, and you play God by taking your own life. And this is the sort of place that she ends up going to. But I have to find the humanness about her, so I find the pain. I find the kernel of pain that makes her behave that way. It's very difficult because she's rather unrelenting, and she's quite blunt, and she's quite hard with people. But when Richard III comes out on stage, people don't expect to feel warm and fuzzy about him. So just because Hedda's a woman, I don't think people need to expect to feel fuzzy about her either.
That's something I really don't care to speak about.
Not to me, dear. Goodness, we were schoolgirls together.
Yes, but you were in the class above me, and I was scared to death of you.
Of me?
Yes, I was terribly frightened of you. Whenever we met on the stairs, you'd always pull my hair.
I did that.
Yes, you did. One time, you told me you were going to burn it all.
I was just teasing, of course.
Yes, well, I was such a little fool then. And anyway, then we drifted so far from one another. We've lived in such completely different worlds.
All the more reason for us to get close again. Now listen, when we were girls, we used to call each other by our first name.
No, I'm sure you're mistaken about that.
I'm sure I'm not. I remember perfectly. We were great friends, and we'll be great friends again. You must call me Hedda.
You're very kind. I'm not used to kindness.
Yeah.
I think Hedda, on her own terms, is a wonderfully spirited, powerful person, and any, job site would like her energy there, I think, Although I don't think it's a kind of a feminist play in the way that maybe Doll's House is, because you have to ask yourself, well, would Hedda be happy if she was the CEO of Norwegian Sardines or something? Not necessarily. I think it's more of an issue of soul. That she is a big soul looking for a place to be, and she's surrounded by these bourgeois petty concerns. And in many ways, she's objectified. If you look at the first scene between Aunt Julia and Tesman, they talk about her as a prize. They talk about her as the HEDDA GABLER, and you won her, and you got to marry her, and now all your dreams have come true. And also, Aunt Julia looks at Hedda as the womb for this child, this nephew to her. Hedda is looked as a commodity or as an aesthetic being. She's not looked at as a person, as an individual. Not that she's not an easy person to penetrate. And if someone were to actually reach out to her, how would she respond? But nobody's really reaching out to her as a person. And the loneliness that she must feel in that, or that she's here to serve somebody else's dream. And what about her?
Taya, dear, how did you dare?
I had gotten to the point where I couldn't see anything else to do.
But what will your husband say when you come back?
Back to him?
Yes.
I'm never going back to him. Never.
Can you talk about Ibsen himself as a playwright, and and his deep insight, or his supposedly deep insight anyway, into the roles of women, and his attempt to portray how they're stuck and frustrated and trying to provoke some liberation.
I think he's sort of a miracle that he wrote these things. I mean, when he wrote Hedda, it was completely rejected at the time that it was performed, and people said that human being doesn't exist, and she's the devil, and it's an aberration of nature, and that human being doesn't exist on this world. And he was way ahead of his times, because I think he was keying into a pathology, as you had said earlier, of a particular kind of person. And I'm very grateful he wrote it.
Right. There's a great story of Ibsen when he was living in Rome. He used to keep a live scorpion under a glass on his table. I noticed the scorpion was withering away. It was sort of dying away. So he'd tear off a segment of a piece of orange, and he'd slide it under, under the glass to the scorpion. And the scorpion would attack the piece of orange and inject all of its venom into it, and then it would revive and be in good health. And he sort of saw this as an image of what he was doing in Rome. He was like reviving from injecting his venom, and how he felt about Norway and that sort of society into his work.
Right.
Can you talk a little bit about, okay, what is this society? This particular production in the Guthrie, one of the great details is that even the flowers are sort of washed out. They've got this washed out color in this. Can you talk about the particular world audiences are seeing in this Norwegian world that we're
It's
entering?
a very cold world. Not to say that there's not beauty in that sort of culture. I come from a Latvian culture, which is very similar in some ways, but there is a kind of a coolness to it, or I think because of the northern terrain. Your winters, you never don't see the light of day except for 3 hours during 8 months of the year, and then of course you have the land of the midnight sun in the summertime, so you sort of revel in that. Just very stark, very cold. I imagine the house that they're in is big and drafty, and there's just not a lot of warmth to be had, and also the distances between the homes, I think, and living in the fjords, and how difficult it was to travel or to visit people. I think Aunt Julia walks over to the house that morning, and it's quite a journey. Not the warmest, they're not in Italy.
Oh, it's good.
The food alone could kill you, I think, between the lutefisk and whatever else they eat.
Good afternoon, Judge. Welcome back.
Good afternoon, Mrs. Testman.
And now, my dear Judge, I'm going to shoot you.
No, don't point that at me.
This is what you get for sneaking in the back way.
Have you gone crazy?
Oh dear, I didn't hit you, did I?
Stop!
Oh, very well then, Judge.
Damn it! You're still playing with guns? What were you shooting at?
Just killing time, Judge. Shooting into the blue!
Allow me, madam.
This idea of shooting venom into something and then being rejuvenated. I think that's one of Hedda's survival techniques, is that she attacks, and then somehow through that attack, or that adrenalizes her and gives her the strength to go on. But she needs to keep having victims. And someone asked at the post-show discussion, well, do you see her as a victim or a victimizer? And to me, people are always both. Oftentimes, if a child is victimized, they become a victimizer later in life. It's that power thing that Hedda talks about. It's a way of feeding. It feeds on itself. When she gets Lovborg to drink the wine, the rum punch, it's like she gets physically excited by it. I think there's an adrenaline thing that happens. When she burns the manuscript, it's a very intense, visceral feeling for her. I think there's a moment, I've decided, where she probably respects her husband the most. And that's when she's burned the manuscript, and Tessman says, how could you do that? And she refuses to answer him, and he finally goes, answer me! And he screams at her. And to me, that moment gets her back into the past, and she remembers her father screaming at her. And I think for a moment she can respect him, because it reminds her of her first love object. You know how oftentimes we associate love with whatever that parent did, whether it was abusing you. You tend to go through life looking for people to abuse you because that feels familiar. And I think she's looking for that intensity. She's looking for someone who will actually bounce up against her. Someone who will say, no, you can't do that. She's in a society where everyone's being codependent and very enabling, and there's no one to say no. And she's dying for someone to say no. She's dying as a child to be disciplined and know what the boundaries are, but everyone's so intimidated by her. And what do you do when you're that large and that powerful, and there's nobody there who can stop you?
You've never had an experience which actually moved you.
Something serious, you mean?
You could put it that way. But now, perhaps you shall.
Are you thinking of all this intrigue with the great professorship? That's something my husband can face alone. I'm not going to give it a thought.
No, I wasn't thinking of that at all. But let's suppose that what is commonly considered the most sacred of life's obligations were suddenly thrust upon you.
Hedda is somebody who supposedly has everything. She's married into this family. She has this beautiful house, and for some reason she cannot find happiness. She's spiritually bankrupt, and the way she was raised and her position in society really curtails any ability to advance as a human being, as an individual. And I think it's very it's the way I relate to that in terms of our society today is that we seem to be in this place where money and material wealth are so prevalent, and yet there's this bankruptcy of spirituality, or this feel somehow this is supposed to fix everything, and it doesn't. And I think that I relate to her on that level, that she's somebody that just is still searching for answers as to who she is, but there are all these roadblocks in the way, and she really just is not allowed to become the person that she's capable of. So I think all of these things contribute to the way she what she must deal with. And then of course she's in a marriage that is arranged more. It's not because she loves Tesman, it's because she needs Tesman, because she needs this sort of this situation in her life, and it's sort of required that she have this kind of protection. So I think that discovering who Hedda Gabler is, to some extent, is sort of understanding the society that she came from.
So answer me, Hedda, darling, how could you do this?
You insist on calling me darling. I won't speak to you.
Can I call you that when we're alone?
No. You have my permission to think it, but you can't say it.
Oh, I see. Because you love Jürgen Tesman.
Love, that's a good one.
So you don't love him?
I'm not going to be unfaithful to him, if that's what you have in mind.
Thank you.
I won't do that.
Hedda, darling, just tell me this one thing.
Here we are. Here come the goodies.
Why are you doing this, sir?
Because I think it's great fun to wait on you, Hedda, darling.
I think she's trying to actually comes up with it as an excuse. But as the conversation goes on, she gets more anxiety, and she has a line later where she says, I'm going to die. I'm going to die of all this. And he says, of what? And she says, I'm going to die of all this absurdity. Right, yes. And I think that's also a key to her character, that she sees life as absurd. Right, right. She sees the way people behave as absurd and not beautiful. She's incredibly obsessed about beauty and doing things beautifully and doing it in a certain way. That's that perfectionism. And she sees normal life as absurd. And that when she says, I'm going to die, I almost think it's some sort of premonition about what happens at the end of the play, but also a premonition about the giving the birth to the child, that there is such a great anxiety about that to her. And to me, that's very key into finding some way of being sympathetic towards her, is that visceral phobia of giving birth.
Ibsen made the statement several times that he never wrote about anything or developed characters that he had himself not experienced. And so, you know, Ibsen's plays come out of his life, his experience of character and circumstance and convention. In his own family life, his father was a merchant who lost his money at an age when Ibsen was pretty young. His mother was very artistic, and there was a contrast of the father with whom he did not have a good relationship, who basically ran them into poverty, and the artistic, lovely mother who he did have a relationship with, but he had to go to work very early. He fathered a child when he was, I think 19, and had to help support that child. When he finally did marry, he married a very strong woman, a woman who was very intelligent, very strong, very outspoken, but he also was very aware in his culture and time, and particularly in Norway at the time, that women could not have that role. Women weren't even admitted to university at Christiania until 1882, 8 years before the play was written. And so women were very much controlled by the conventions of the society, of Norwegian culture. And his own wife, while very outspoken and he was very dependent on her, he also knew that she would never have the role that a man could assume in society.
Then what will I do with my life?
You must live it as though you've never known me.
I can't do that.
You have to, Thea. You have to try. You have to go home.
No! Never! I will be with you wherever you are. You are not going to drive me away. I am staying, and I'll be with you when the book comes out.
Oh yes, the book!
Yes, the book. My book and Thea's, for that's what it is.
Yes, that's what it is. And that's why I have the right to be there with you when it comes out. I want to see you honored and respected again.
One of your lines is that you consider it to be like a female Hamlet, or the equivalent of Hamlet for...
Yes, very loosely.
Very loosely.
Very
right.
loosely.
Can you
The parallels I find are, there is this sort of ghost of the father that's sort of haunting
Right.
the entire play,
Right.
and the deep love for the father. Also, there's a bit of to be or not to be,
Right.
if you look at it.
Right, yes.
Also, just simply the size of the role and the sort of journey that you have to take. And also, Hamlet is somewhat obsessed with, he has an inability to act. And in
Yes,
fact, Lovborg says to, this will be the line that I quote for you, that Lovborg says that Thea has courage. And Thea says, I have courage? And he says, yes, you have the courage to act.
Right.
The courage to help me.
Right.
And Hedda says, yes, courage, if only one had it.
Right.
And Lovborg says, then what? And she says, then one might actually begin to live. And she knows that she lacks courage. And as much as that she points the finger and says, I hate all of you, someone who hates that much also has a great deal of self-loathing. And her self-loathing is huge. But to suppress it and to live with it, she strikes out. She cannot do the deep psychological work of loss and mourning, the things that she doesn't have. She refuses to be that vulnerable. So she fights instead. And she knows she lacks courage. He says, you're a coward. She says, yes, a terrible coward. She has a few moments of insight about herself. She says she's a coward. She says that I think I often have talent for just one thing in this life, for boring myself to death.
That's right. That was a great line.
Yeah.
Also, yes.
So there are glimmers.
Right.
Ibsen gives us glimmers, little glimpses into what she feels about herself, but she doesn't live there long. She can't afford to.
Right.
There's something of a mortuary about it. It smells of rot. The bouquet, the day after the ball.
I wanted to really strip down and use color and silhouette as my strongest elements. So I've chosen, it's a very neutral palette, and because of the wonderful support here at the Guthrie, I was able to have almost everything made new, including hats, including hand-tied wigs. It's really an amazing group of costumes and accessories. I have used very subtle neutral colors, and so that when Hedda comes on in her green dress in Act 2, it's really the most color you'll see all night. And I think we were successful in, the play starts out in a very pale, well not pale, but a medium tone palette that is sort of soft contrasts, and then moves into as the sort of drama increases and the stakes get higher and the lights get dimmer, it gets to more night scenes, then I've got black and white contrast and everything gets much darker. So the progression is nice.
The play itself is very difficult. I mean, psychologically, it literally tears you apart. To come up to grips with the thought that the ultimate solution to one's life is suicide, a giving away, an ending, and to think that possibly that this is something you know, includes part of your reality, without any judgment whether or not this is good, bad, allowable, decent, indecent, takes a great deal of courage, I think. And David, who I've worked with on a few projects now, thought that we had the courage to investigate this subject matter in a deep and meaningful way that quite possibly would translate across the footlights here to the audience. And the way that this possibly translates, I think, in, physically, we're talking about interiors. We're talking about a psychological interior. We're talking about an environment in which you rarely see the light. The darkness is a reflection of, both the interior and exterior. The darkness is everything. The light, when it comes, is fleeting and elusive. You might not even be there to see it when it comes. You might not be receptive to it. I think this is somewhat delineated in the set in a practical way, or in a real way, in that this is sort of like a prison, or a maze, or a trap. Hedda can't get out of this place physically. She never leaves the stage. She doesn't go to her bedroom to sleep. She sleeps in the parlor. She opens the doors to the outside to get a breath of fresh air, but she can't exit the room. She can't physically leave the space. She can't escape.
The beginning of acts usually are sound. We have a sort of a montage of music and sound effects, which is elements of wind and breathing and some different tonal pitches, and these really suggest maybe a supernatural connection or a different plane of existence than what we go into in the acts. Might be a possible connection with her father, or it's quite different in these prologues. The music we've used is from two composers, basically, Edvard Grieg and Carl Nielsen, and mostly piano, and there's a few cello sonatas. Very dark Scandinavian music.
You recognize it?
You should have used it then.
You use it now.